Welcome back to the TKC Games blog, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and having a wee chat. As you can see, instead of having my talking head staring at you through the monitor, we got a little map of southern Ukraine. This is from one of the websites who claim to have live updates. What is noticeable, most of it is from Ukrainian sources. So whether or not the Russians have a different perspective in this, we need to be aware. They're saying that there's over 92 attacks in the Bakhmut area, Lyman, and so on and so forth. I guess is this area here that we're looking at here. Now, this apparently is Bakhmut. Apparently. We keep getting told that this area is of no strategic value, but if you look at it from a slightly different perspective, there's railway lines, there's a road crossroads, etc., etc., etc. And Kramatorsk is a fairly important industrial town. As you can see, the Russians had moved into this area and get kicked out. But please bear in mind that all the way to Luhansk is where the Ukrainian counteroffensive supposedly reached. Not that I'm being cynical, guys. Every one of the bombs here apparently is an artillery strike, and the rifles are infantry strikes or ground combat. So it appears there's a lot of shelling all along the front and a few infantry attacks or armoured strikes or whatever in the general area. I've got to be honest, the stuff we're about to talk about, Geoff and I, is going to blow your mind if you think this is intensive combat. We don't know what each of these 92 attacks is. Is it a sniper? Is it a platoon? Is it a company? Is it a single battery of artillery? Is it a full regiment? We don't know. And that is part of our problem when we look at Ukraine. I'm not actually of the view that some of the numbers we're seeing are particularly useful. When you consider that we're getting told there's assorted shelling in these areas, right? And there's more shelling down here and so on. That's kind of what you expect. I hate to say it when there's a war. So, are these places pointless to attack? No. If you're fighting a war, everything's a target, unfortunately, for the people there. It's quite clear that Ukraine are not doing as well as they'd like in this area. It's also quite clear that our friends the Russians aren't doing so well. So let's move away from this. And we're going to come on to the topic we've got for this little chat we've got today. And essentially what it is has anything changed from World War I through World War II to today? So Jeffrey, Brusilov's offensive, 1916.
Right, so up to 1916, the Russians have had some fairly serious problems fighting the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, with the exception of certain offensives, including their initial very successful penetration into East Prussia, where the Cossacks have a lovely time rampaging through it for a certain amount of time before the Germans kick them out. However, by 1916, the Russians really do want to start making breakthroughs. We talk about the Russian juggernaut being quite large, but it needs to be kept in mind that the Russians managed to mobilize only 5% of their population compared to the Germans or the French. The statistics I have here is 12% of the German population and 16% of the French were mobilized for military service. So why is Russia in such a pickle? Firstly, her birth rate it's high, but it's occurred in such a way that a large number of men are either not yet eligible for military service, or the amount that have been killed during some of the very nasty initial attacks of the First World War. Remember that the Battle of Tannenberg was probably one of the deadliest battles in human history at that point, when Samsonov was completely outflanked by Hindenburg and friends.
Yeah.
So you have this problem.
So you got a manpower shortage. Is it not true to say that the Imperial Tsarist army was probably a bit short of equipment into the first, certainly, year and a half of the war?
Telephones. Not enough telephones.
Yeah.
At one point, they rely on a teleprinter which can print 1,200 words an hour, which for the very short sort of semaphore style messages, okay, but if you want a detailed report, you're not getting anywhere with that. There's also the fact that the postmaster of the Warsaw office, one of his staff will collect messages going between the front and Stavka once a day and then take it 60 miles down the road by car. This is hardly the sort of massive telephone exchange under Downing Street during World War II. This doesn't compare.
Yeah. So what we've got is Russia is kind of struggling to put technology into its military at a level which would give it a higher combat effectiveness. I know from my own reading in World War I that in the East, essentially the Russians have a problem providing sufficient rifles and enough field artillery to support all their units to begin with. But I also know that by 1916, a number of these things have been fixed. And they are looking at a strategic offensive for the summer or the spring. Depends how you want to judge that. And the initial plan, apparently, was in for the Western Front, which is this bit up here, which I'm going to try, don't know if I can, but this area up at the top where you see SA on the screen, let's zoom it in a wee bit, says Group Eberth. It was to move straight for Warsaw, with the Southwestern Front under Brusilov essentially launching a series of holding attacks. And you can see from the West Point maps that we're looking at here, there's an implication that some of the line's quite heavily fortified, in other areas it's not. Some of that's because of the location, some of it's just simply put, it wasn't necessary given troop densities in the east, which are much lower than they are in the Western Front. Even so, human wave attacks, what people think of as World War I, men essentially just getting out of trench and walking in a straight line towards the bad guys, had proven catastrophic to every army. And there was a lot of argument, as I understand it, in Stavka about how things should be done. And eventually Brusilov came up with this concept that assault troops, specially trained, provided with good maps of the opposing forces, supported with as much artillery as could be assembled, with large quantities of ammunition, operating on a fire plan of some considerable complexity, would break the line. Tsar Nicholas, who I think was probably under quite a lot of political pressure, decided to say yes to that. And what you get is this concept here of a series of staged attacks on the main axis towards Kovel and essentially going towards Lemberg, a secondary attack, and down towards Stanislav down here. The bottom line is you've got a main assault and centre and flanking attacks to try and help exploit it. And if you come over to the right-hand map, you can see the different phases of the offensives. And progressively, the Austrian armies defending, especially the Fourth Army, take an absolute pounding. Now, Lissingen's army up in the north is actually German forces largely fought at Tannenberg. It's very good quality, but even it is struggling to contain these very carefully planned, short by the standards of World War I offensives. But like anybody who's doing well, they got a bit greedy. And the Russians start to push a lot harder. And the secondary offensives are then upgraded to full-blown offensives. And I know there is an operation further north from Third Army's area. None of that goes particularly well. And eventually things peter out in the middle of September of 1916. The casualty rates are huge on both sides. And that's something that we're going to actually have a quick look at. The Brusilov offensive, which is claimed to have started run for about 3 months and a half month, almost to the day, appears to have cost Imperial Russia between I mean, this staggers the mind. 1 to 1.45 million men, either dead, wounded, or captured. Only 60,000 were prisoners. To compare that, by the way, with the Second World War, the Kiev encirclement in 1941 cost the Red Army about 650,000 troops, most of whom were prisoners. The actual death toll was nothing like as high as you might think during the combat. During imprisonment afterwards, that's a whole different question, which we're not going to get into tonight. The Austrians and the Hungarian forces, the Habsburg forces, if you prefer, took about 600 and something thousand casualties of all causes. The Germans lost another 300 and odd thousand men, and there's obviously some kind of Ottoman presence because they lose 12,000 bubbas. It's about, give or take, 1.5 to 1 in favour of the Central Powers, this loss rate. About. That said, during the Second World War, most offensives where infantry were used heavily, in terms of the guys actually doing the shooting and getting out of their foxholes and trenches and moving forward, very often the losses were 2, 3, and 4 to 1 in favour of the defender. And we're going to come on to that in a wee minute. Now, Geoff, do you think this is starting to compare with what we saw in that other map that I pulled up about what was going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, to a certain extent.
If we come back to it briefly, tell me what you're thinking.
Well, what you said about the Russians sort of fixing a lot of their problems, that makes sense, and it looks like the Russians now, with this, are starting to exploit great utilization of mass fires, artillery. They are clearly doing reasonably well with air power at the moment, and they're slowly grinding forward in Bakhmut. So really, for me, the question is, to what extent is it more like 1943-44, where the Russians went from a military that was only half reformed, but nonetheless managed to turn it into a very, very effective fighting machine, or 1916, 1917, where the Russian military again reformed. The origins of stormtrooper warfare comes from Brusilov, but again, that lack of manpower that's surprisingly is a historical flaw of Russia's at times, nonetheless hobbles them. They take 1 million men in this Brusilov offensive. They lose 1 million men. But given that if they'd wait, they'd have to wait a few more years for the overwhelming force to become available. They have to rely on less well-trained troops, which I think is a factor why, no matter how well Brusilov refigures the Russian army, it starts to take serious losses here, culminating in the catastrophic end to the war for the Russia in 1917.
Yeah, I don't think you're far wrong here, and I think part of it is that if you try without having full understanding of what the opposing force can do to sustain an offensive operation, things can go really badly wrong, and indeed they do, for the Russians eventually in 1916. If you think about it, they could maybe understand this little bit here, and maybe this little bit here, and maybe this little bit here, that little bit, and so on and so forth. But every time you move everything, the other side's still digging in while you're moving all your heavy stuff. So you have to relearn what's in front of you. And that works okay, I think, for the first period of time. And in fact, they definitely broke the line, it appears, against the Habsburg Fourth Army. But if you're getting hit in the flank, as did happen from the German forces north, Second Army was also told to counterattack. Eventually, you're essentially you're up against a new defensive line. You've got to do it all again. And if you do it too quickly without the communications and the intelligence assets and so on, you're probably in trouble, you know. And I think we'll move this then to another battle, which people will say, but what's the relevance? Well, the relevance here is Verdun. And actually, there's quite a lot of effort went in to launching the Brusilov offensive because of Verdun. So remember, we're talking about 1.5 million Russian losses and just under 1 million, not far off the full million, Central Power losses. So Verdun takes place over 9 months, and actually it's 3 weeks and 6 days. That's near as damn it 10 months. The total loss rate, and this is between the French, who are very good, and the Germans, who are outstanding, well led, lots of firepower, some seriously capable commanders and so on and so forth involved in this. The French defending and counter-attacking where necessary lose around 400,000 men. But 163,000 died, which is a tragedy. The Central Powers, in other words, Germany in this case, because the Habsburg forces are not involved in this part of France, take 355,000 casualties. They punch in, and there's a map, I think, that I'm hoping we have here. Indeed, there is. There we go. So you can see that the German plan essentially is to launch a frontal attack around the perimeter of Verdun. Now, I'm talking about Verdun very quickly here because I looked at this with Corey, my head researcher, and my immediate knee-jerk reaction was, what idiot came up with that plan? It's dumb. I'm a layman. He's a colonel, almost became a brigadier general. He knows a bit about this kind of stuff. But I can read a map. And my suggestion was that the Germans should have hit 3rd Army over here and the 3rd Reserve Division down here and tried to envelop Verdun. That would probably have done a bit better. They might actually have gotten the town. And only once those series of attacks were going in, maybe should they have done something up here where the main effort appears to have been. Corey thought it was a good idea, but alternate history aside, there's about 750,000 casualties in total in this area. Very small area around Verdun. It's absolutely horrendous loss rates. But that is half of what happened in the east. So firepower here was much more intense, from what I understand. So the big guns actually, it sounds crazy given the huge number of people that died, possibly saved some lives. And also the French are in fortifications and the Germans take some fortifications and build their own in the area. So Verdun, for all its crisis point, as it were, for the French Republic, and the fact it pushed the British into the Somme, clearly pushes the Germans into operations in the east, is not the one we need to look at. Frankly, what we really need to look at is Battle of Rizov. So, Rizov is a town in Russia. If you take a look, Moscow is here, Rizov is over here, and Kalinin is here, Borodino, Moshaivsk, Kaluga, and Vyazma is here. Smolensk is just off somewhere over this area here. So it's in the Moscow area as far as such things go. The blue area is as far as the Germans got in 1941 before the counteroffensive. And actually, by the end of these operations, the salient was much smoother than it looks in this. The Germans were able to clean a whole pile of it out. But the reality of it is this salient directly threatens Moscow and would have enabled the Germans in certain circumstances to launch offensive operations from forward positions. And Adolf Hitler point blank refused to permit the German army pull out. Now, needless to say, Stalin and Stavka were of the same view. This is dangerous, we've got to get rid. And this little list here of multiple operations shows just how vital this was seen. You got Rizov Vyazma in early January through to the end of April of 1942. And there's various different bits and pieces here, some of which worked, most of which didn't. You've got Seydlitz, which is a German counter-strike in July, which cleaned out all the bits and pieces on the northern flank. Remember I said it gets a bit shallower. And then in the summer, not long after Operation Seydlitz, the Russians have a dig at this area in the first Shaikovka offensive. And we're going to look at that right here. The casualties on the German side were approximately 1/5 of their deployed troops, with 350,000 guys. The Russians attack with 500,000 men and lose around 300,000. But they're pumping in bodies all the way through. So you can see that the total number of men to begin with is 486,000. It drops down to 335,000 here. They lose a huge number of tanks, but they actually pin down and attrit the Germans quite significantly here. But the losses were, in effect, catastrophic for both sides. But the strategic salient, which you can see here, is still really not, how shall I put it? There's still an issue here that the salient effectively must be removed. So we get back to status quo ante, and bearing in mind operations are going ahead down in the south, and Stalingrad is now a major battlefield. The plan for the autumn-winter offensive for 1942 into 43 involves multiple thrusts. One becomes Operation Star up in the north, which is the deblockading of Leningrad. There's assorted operations called Operation Mars in and around Army Group Center Zone, if you're German. And further south, you have Uranus and Saturn, which are designed to have a dig at the Army Group South operation towards Stalingrad. Now, we know that that one worked pretty well and inflicted catastrophic losses on at least one German army, and its follow-ups, Little Saturn and its various satellite operations, pummel 2nd German Army, make a hell of a mess out of the 8th Italian, 2nd Hungarian, and 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, inflicting around 500,000 losses in the Axis. Mars is arguably the most important of these operations because it's designed to get rid of this huge salient. And the idea was to smash through in different ways and just chop it up into smaller bits. And don't believe, by the way, that these Panzer Corps headquarter names and so on means there's shed loads of tanks there. There's actually about 3 or 4 armoured divisions and motorised divisions there and a cavalry division. And they're mostly in reserve, and that's the key. This is why it fails. So when the Russians break through, the infantry stands and fights in its positions. Even encircle, the German infantry is not permitted and actually does not withdraw. Okay? But the counterattack is lethal. It chops up the offensive. It breaks off the spearheads, which had been slowed down and then impaled upon the infantry. And the losses are horrific. Now, again, it depends on source. But we know from having read multiple different books about this, the Germans lose a minimum of 40,000 men. They're also unable to move at least 4 of the motorised divisions, of which there's 8, plus potentially the SS Cavalry Division, down into Army Group South. Almost all of them, by the way, had either got their movement orders or were tagged to go, which meant that the disaster in the south which these divisions might well have prevented from becoming as bad as it was, continued to evolve and grow legs of its own and run away into the distance. But Operation Mars was a failure. It cost the Soviets between 150 and 235,000 men, depending on source. 1,600 tanks are claimed destroyed by the Germans. I'll say claimed because I'm never too sure about these numbers. And I'm never too sure about them because sometimes the production numbers don't add up to a point where German loss claims would actually have existed on the battlefield. There is then, after Operation Mars, let's do it again, why don't we, guys? There is then the Veliki Luki operation, which is this area over here. You can see it just there. That actually worked. They made a mess of the German forces there, and it caused the Germans to have to withdraw assets from elsewhere to prop it up. All of that said, Operation Buffel was a German withdrawal, something similar to what they did with the Hindenburg Line in 1917, was it? Before Passchendaele, they pulled back onto their prepared positions to shorten the line, free up reserves. It's exactly the same thing. It's all Buffel does. It's how the Russians get that salient. Now, we already know from doing a bit of maths that Isayev's number here is probably nonsense. Gerasimova might be right. Now, I know people in Russia, and they've told me that farmers in that area still plough up bodies. I mean, it's horrific. The Germans lost at least 500,000 men in operations there. The Russians maybe lost, the Soviets, correction, maybe lost 2.3 million men. It is very similar to Passchendaele or the Somme or Brusilov's offensive in scale. And even with the allocation of air power, large numbers of aircraft, huge numbers of tanks, massive amounts of artillery on both sides, the casualty rates are catastrophic. Nobody's going anywhere fast. And we're back to this. So, guys, are we starting to see the same thing here? That this has just become, in gaming terms, a slugging match round this salient here. Should there be a better plan? Maybe this so-called series of failures with the Russians, you can see in blue, did in fact almost take Kiev. They certainly moved very rapidly. Do they need to re-examine this strategy that they have of plugging away in this area down in the south? Or is bleeding the Ukrainians dry a valid strategy, given from total population, there are many more Russians than there are Ukrainians? That's a terrifying and a horrible thought. But it is one that I think is probably worth taking a look at. Geoff, what do you think? I mean, what are you seeing when I talk to you about and walk you through Rizov and walk you through Brusilov and walk you through Verdun? And then you see this, where, by the way, guys, we don't necessarily have a huge amount of information about it.
Well, there is one piece of information that I've come across recently suggesting the Ukrainians are finding it very difficult to deploy tanks en masse, which means that providing them with Western armor, they've got to learn or relearn how to utilize a full-on armor division with massed artillery support, etc., etc., etc. But then on the flip side of the coin, looking at the Russians, they seem to be having problems with piecemeal stuff. Remember when we were talking previously about the sort of small scale of what you see on these drones when they take all these pieces of footage of what appear to be tiny little skirmishes. And I think some of this is down to the fact that the manpower on both sides is so small. I mean, this is nothing at all compared to World War II in terms of scale. That maybe they're trying to cover more territory cover a lot of territory with much fewer men than previously. So I think if a particular side can group together enough units, use them en masse, then they might actually have a chance of doing some very serious damage. The one thing to remember with the Ukrainians is that even if they push the Russians all the way back to Russia, the Russians can just come back again because the Ukrainians will not be able to go into Russia. That is so. What the Ukrainians have to do, and this is horrible, they have to completely and utterly annihilate the Russian army. It's that simple. To make sure the Russians survivors on the other side can't come back into Ukraine. The Russians have it a bit easier in that all they have to do is just build up their reserves, and maybe if you have these little pinpoints of formations, and then those pinpoints start to grow to the point where they start to overlap, and then you start to see something more on the lines of what you see in World War II. So if the Russians can do that, then I think they'd have a chance.
You know, to be quite clear, in every single instance, the Red Army, except for Buffel, when the Germans pulled out, they actually broke the German line. But the German response with mobile reserves was so violent and so intense that essentially it's effectively what happened at the beginning of the Ukraine war. The Russians blew through, they couldn't sustain the shoulder, everything had to pull out or get encircled. That's what you see time and again in the East. And it doesn't matter which battle it is. Unless you can hold the shoulder open and go really deep, real fast, it always slows down and comes a grinding match. And whether Adolf Hitler liked it or not, Stalin was right. Quantity has a quality all of its own. And I tend to agree with you. Ukraine's going to have to effectively massacre the Red Army. Sorry, the Russian army. I can't see how. I can't see how they're going to do it. If we give them 100 decent tanks, we might kill. I don't know if you put Western trained crews who really know their stuff, who've got some combat experience, they might kill 40 Russian tanks or 20 Russian tanks each. The Russians have got 25,000 tanks, guys. And if they can get the clutch working or whatever it is that's missing from the ones that don't work, you know. Yes, a whole pile of Russian tanks are going to be scrap metal, but they're going to have tanks and Ukraine won't. So, yeah, you have to give them stuff, I guess, if you want to keep this war going. But you have to be aware that until the politicians on both sides are willing to sit and talk, casualty rates and numbers will rise, and no decision on the battlefield appears possible, to my mind, at this time. I'm really surprised that the Russians haven't retried mobile warfare further north. They have sucked in huge amounts of Ukrainian firepower into the south. That said, what we're seeing now, simply put, that because of ongoing and probably quite understandable Russian paranoia about China and the West, particularly NATO, are we actually seeing what Russia can afford to waste?
The problem is that they did lose some very elite formations. First Guards tank army, gone. So,
You see, the thing is, the good stuff still hasn't gone into combat. Third Shock Army still floating about, but it's up opposite the Baltic states. It's in Novgorod, last I heard. That number's pretty old, by the way, but and I know someone who gave me some information about it, and I can tell you it's actually pretty good. But it's not there. There's a whole pile of stuff that's pretty good that isn't being deployed.
I think the best way to explain some of this is initially the Russians send in good stuff and it doesn't go well. A lot of stuff gets blown up. First Guards gets wiped out. Then they decide, right, we've still got the core of some nice stuff. We'll keep it over here. We don't want to waste it. We don't want to have any more nasty surprises. So then you get Wagner Group. And you get, and Wagner Group are effectively a light infantry mercenary army, complemented with conscript cannon fodder. So they send that in along with whatever stuff they managed to Gerasimov and Surovkin managed to raise in the draft, and then they're sort of trying to expend that whilst sending in T-60s, unmodified T-60s, and hopefully from their perspective, hope that attracts any good Ukrainian stuff, so that their remaining high quality equipment and infantry they can then send in and crush the Ukrainians, or keep it behind just in case the Chinese try to have a crack at Siberia, and just hope that their low quality trash manage to just swarm the Ukrainians without having to use anything else. That's the best way I can see it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've probably got a point there, and to be fair, this use of God knows where the 20,000 Wagner group people have come from. I've heard all kinds of rumors about them being recruited across Africa and you know, the Middle East and so on and so forth. Doesn't really matter. Their commanders are getting annoyed that they're not getting, as they see it, adequate support. They want artillery, firepower, and so on. That tells me either there's another logistical blockage, and I find it really hard to comprehend why the Russians can't produce some trucks or just requisition trucks. Equally, when you start to look at what I've just seen, Luhansk is Russian. It's captured, so controlled by the Russians. Yeah, there's missile strikes there. I know, and I mentioned it last time, stuff is going on further north. Repeated artillery and missile strikes, and I suspect it's MLRS strikes on Belgorod and towns to the south of that. Now, they're all logistical centres for operations against Ukraine. And it does spring to mind that if you're going to fight a mobile war, you need huge amounts of transport, huge amounts of equipment, and it doesn't matter if it's good or bad. You know, arguably a T-34 by the end of the war was not a match for a Panther.
No.
But it could kill the Panther, it just wasn't as good overall. But if you've only got a few hundred Panthers and the other guy's got a few thousand tanks, quality is not as vital as you might think, especially if you can augment that with a huge amount of firepower from tube artillery, rocket artillery, and so on. What we aren't seeing is the Russian application of firepower the way I anticipated at the beginning. I anticipated literally guns wheel hub to wheel hub from one end of Ukraine to the other, 3 or 4 kilometers deep, with a row of guns every 500-600 yards and just flatten the place. That's the way the Red Army used to fight. And this is one of the things that places like Rizov, they learned how to do it. They learned how to do it at Stalingrad. They learned that they needed better command control, that they needed people who could come in and coordinate operations. That's what Vasilievsky, that's what Zhukov, that's what Konev, that's what the top Soviet guys actually did. They didn't necessarily do all the planning. They did some of it, but the local commanders did much of the planning. But these top generals in the Red Army would come in with extra toys because they had a line to the boss. They could phone up Stalin and say to the Vozhd, well, I must have this, and they'd get it because they were supposedly very loyal to Uncle Joe. So they turned up with more firepower, more ammunition, more POL, some more tanks, whatever they felt they needed, some more aircraft, and they plugged that into the battle plan, made it overwhelming in the right places, hopefully, and then they coordinated how all of that fit together. That's not what I'm seeing at all here. I'm just seeing some relatively unrelated, and from a bit of map reading there, it looked pretty dumb. Again, some of these operations. I've said that the one at the beginning of the war was a Hail Mary, and if it had worked, they'd have won instantly. I think they got real unlucky with that, and we're going to keep saying that. But there's also another thing. Go on the internet. Find where Ukrainian people are. By that, I mean the women and the children. They are out there right now in Britain. They're probably in the USA. I know there's some in Canada. They're all over Poland. They're all over Germany, France, Italy, Spain. These are productive mouths. people are teachers, biochemists, physicists, economics people, people who ran businesses. Ukraine's economy has had the backside ripped out of it by this. How many of those people are going to want to go back to Ukraine?
Well, I keep hearing from various people they do at the moment. Give it a couple of months, give it a year, give it 2 years, give it 3, and then that could change. I mean, it depends on how much a Marshall Plan. Let's just assume that Ukraine managed to magically utilize several thousand Bradleys to kill every Russian on the field, just for argument's sake, just for a second. There's still going to be the water pipe is still burst.
Yeah.
The wire running between the power plant and the house is still broken. So that's going to require a huge amount of Marshall Plan money to fix it. And we'll have to fix it. It's that simple. The Ukrainians are not going to have the capacity to do that all themselves. There is just too much that's been annihilated. You look at Bakhmut or Mariupol, it's just rubble. It looks like Hiroshima in places.
Right, okay. So there is some firepower getting applied then. But
very concentrated, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying, you see, the thing is, generally speaking, when people leave, a chunk of them want to go back. There's 10 or 12 million Ukrainians have left.
Yeah.
Even if 10, 20% don't want to go back, that's a cataclysmic blow to the economy.
Yeah.
I'm really dubious about some of the loss rate numbers. I don't think it's as intense as overall. I think the loss rates are somewhat ambitious. 20-odd thousand Wagner Bubbas that are there, you're looking at, what's that? It's like 1 division, 2 divisions, give or take. And bearing in mind that they haven't stopped their presence in Syria and wherever else around Africa and the Middle East that they operate. So there's probably 15,000. So 1 division maybe of Wagner guys, and that's an infantry unit in one area. We're not talking here about what you see at Rizov, where every combined arms army is told, you've got 9 divisions, 6 of them become your shock group, go attack. And Brusilov does much the same thing. He says every unit will form and train shock assets, and then the bulk of your army will go do it while the other units hold the line. And then if you break through, these units leapfrog forward, hold the line while you refit, replan, do it again. We're not seeing that massive intensity over extended areas of front. The Brusilov offensive, just so you know, guys, starts where the Russians attack from in Belarus and ends all the way down on the border with Romania. 700 miles long, that front. We've just had a look. Nothing's happening, according to that map, other than very low-level stuff, along the vast majority of the front line. There is combat in the southeast. There's some artillery strikes elsewhere, just to keep everybody honest, and the odd rocket strike, but we're not looking at a front-to-front or border-to-border attack in Ukraine. And that concerns me about what could be done and what the hell happens if that happens. And I don't want to get into it today. I'm going to throw that out there because I really think it would be interesting to start getting a bit of feedback from those of you bother following us. And I think if you've got information, go to our website, tkcgames.com, and send us it through the info at email address. We want to know a bit more because we have some expertise. We have expert people we work with. We know people who are from these areas. We have contacts, but we aren't getting both sides of the story. And I'd be really interested to hear, not propaganda, not, oh, Vladimir Putin's brilliant and these horrible Ukrainians are terrible, not Zelensky's a genius and he's fantastic and all that, and this Putin guy's awful. You already know that you think that. But if you've got family who are there, if you know people are actually doing the fighting, I'd love to hear a little bit about what's going on, especially if it's not done around Bakhmut and in the south there. I want to hear what's going on elsewhere, because that's really important, because that gives us a better picture. Is it similar to the 400 miles around the Rizov salient with divisions on a very short frontage? Or is it battalions spread out over huge areas and only in a very few zones has force been massed to create the horrific destruction that Geoffrey's mentioned? Anyway, all that said, we are done for this evening, and thank you so much for coming on board and sitting watching us. We really do appreciate it, and I'm aware that what we say is not always as nice as you might want. It can be really contentious. So if you liked it, tell us. If you didn't like it, tell us. And either way, follow us. We will be back for more. We'll see you in a few days' time. Have a really good one. Have a great week to come. And thank you so much for watching us. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.